on behalf of the Board of Directors of WOS and the phenomenal volunteers and all of the membership, WOS acknowledges that the meeting tonight is a broadcast from what many of us birders refer to as the Puget Sound lowlands. And we acknowledge that this is a traditional home of the Coast Salish people, including the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish, who have stewarded this land for many generations. Our enjoyment and the study of birds, their habitats extend across vast and far-flung regions of this state and elsewhere. And we respectfully acknowledge the lands we are visiting and that they are the homelands of the indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest. Please tread gently, treat these places with respect. Yeah, it's a great honor to read that. Just a couple of very quick bits of information. Lots of planning and activity is going on. The bi-state planning for the 2021 Astoria Annual Conference, maybe, is resurrected, and that's being discussed right now. I guess the board will decide in May whether that's to come to pass. Also, the last couple of days, there's been discussion about bringing back field trips and conversation regarding the nature of COVID safety and the extent to which the protocol can be implemented to make them safe and enjoyable. So we're marching forward, and part of what is really online now, I think we're ready to hear from Vicki about some of the networking, social media, and other forms of letting the membership and friends know what we're doing and what we're all about. Vicki?
Thank you very much, Dave, and welcome everybody. I will go ahead and point out we're looking at a new page at WOS.org called WOS Online. And in particular, the first item below it says WOS monthly meeting presentations on YouTube. And in January, in response to a lot of requests, the WOS Board approved recording and making monthly meeting presentations available online when possible. And thanks to our presenters' generosity and to Elaine Trang, WOS is now posting many of these presentations on WOS's YouTube channel so that you can look at them at any time and permanently. And you can find a link to the presentations at WOS.org. And I have one announcement before I introduce tonight's speaker, and that is about next month's presentation on April 5th. It's a topic many of us birders get excited about, Washington's rarities, where and when. And we could not have a more appropriate presenter, Matt Bartles, who is Secretary of the Washington Rare Birds Records Committee. So you won't want to miss that. And now for tonight's presentation. In the fall, when I began taking on responsibility for presentations at future WOS meetings, I thought I need to find some potential speakers. And realizing that we were going to stay on Zoom for a long time, I thought, well, we could have speakers from anywhere in the state. So I wrote to some really fine Eastern Washington birders asking them if they could recommend people from the East Side who might have interesting material to share with us. And to my great delight, I quickly got a response from Andy Stepnevsky, who had a very enthusiastic recommendation for our speaker tonight, Jeff Kozma. I'm going to read you what he said. Jeff is an excellent speaker and interpreter. He's an accomplished researcher and is able to present science clearly as well as share his wonderment of nature. Well, with a recommendation like that, I promptly called Jeff, and happily we were able to settle on tonight for him to give us a presentation about the Gray Flycatcher. And I also asked Jeff if he would just give you a quick thumbnail sketch of his academic and professional background. And now I'll turn it over to Jeff Kozma.
All right, well, thank you very much, Vicki. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to talk at the WOS meeting tonight. This is very, as I was talking a little bit earlier, this is very different for me. I've never done a virtual presentation before. I'm very used to standing up in front of a group of people and talking and chatting. So this is kind of a little bit new for me. But just start this here. All right, so my background is I'm originally from New York State, from the Buffalo area, and I did my undergraduate work at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse. And from then I went on to Texas Tech University to get my master's degree. And for my master's, I studied neotropical migrants as they migrate through the Chihuahuan Desert in south central New Mexico, and also studied the breeding bird community there. And I did that for 3 field seasons. And then when I was done with graduate school, my major professor took a new job at the University of Wisconsin. And so I followed her up there for about 6 months and worked on some data, worked on preparing manuscripts for publications. And then life took a change. I got married, and both my wife and I were looking for jobs, throwing resumes out all over the place. And I was offered a position at the Yakama Training Center as a wildlife biologist. So that was my first, I guess, starting job outside of graduate school. So we decided, well, we don't have any offers, so we're going to move to Washington. And so that was in 1996. And I've been here ever since. I worked about 3 years on the training center, doing a variety of different things, surveying for sage grouse on their leks in the spring, doing bald eagle surveys in their wintering roosts, doing raptor migration surveys, songbird surveys in the shrub steppe. So a variety of different things there on the training center. And then in 2002, I started as a wildlife biologist at the Yakama Nation, where I currently am. And I've been there ever since and enjoying every minute of it. My main job as a wildlife biologist for the Yakama Nation is working off the reservation on the Yakama ceded lands. And so that's lands that they don't outright own, but they have all their usual and accustomed rights to those lands for hunting, fishing, root gathering, any kind of cultural activities. And so I cover, let's see, all the way from Chelan County down to Klickitat County and over to Skamania County. So quite a big area in the ceded lands. And I review timber sales for the tribe, and particularly looking at wildlife resources, wildlife habitat, and wildlife species of concern, such as northern spot owl habitat, northern goshawks, western gray squirrels, things of that nature. And not that I'm not busy enough. On the side, I also do research when I can. And I do have a long-term study on white-headed woodpeckers in the Wenas area, just northwest of Yakama. And that's where I did this research. It's kind of like another side project on top of that, looking at gray flycatcher nesting ecology. So that's what I'm going to present tonight. And I wanted to acknowledge my 2 co-authors on this study, Andrew Krull and Jamie Thornton Fox. Both of them work for Weyerhaeuser. And Andrew is a long-term collaborator of mine on a lot of my research papers. He is a very, very good statistician and also a very good computer programmer. And so he and Jamie both worked on the detailed analysis of the nest survival that I'm going to present part of tonight. And so without their help, I wouldn't be able to do the extensive analysis and get to a lot of the questions that I want to ask with my research without their help. So I just wanted to point out my co-authors there, and they've been a great help on a lot of my research. Okay, so let's get into the study tonight. So the little gray tyrant is another common name for the gray flycatcher. And they get the name tyrant because they're a member of the genus Amphidonax, which also means gnat master. They're similar in appearance to a lot of other small flycatchers in Washington, such as the dusky, the Hammonds, and the willow, and other small flycatchers. And I find the easiest way, at least on east slopes of the Cascades here, to really differentiate them is first by habitat. Gray flycatchers breed in probably the driest habitat type, and a variety of habitat types. But here in Washington, from the shrub steppe up to Ponderosa Pine, and then duskies are a little bit more mesic. They'll be in areas like riparian areas through where gray flycatchers nest, but duskies don't nest in the uplands. And then of course, Hammonds are up a little bit higher in elevation and pure conifer forest, and willows are more marshy. So outside of the migration season, you can kind of differentiate them based on the habitats that they use for breeding. So the gray flycatcher I like to think of as the more drier habitat types. They do eat entirely insects during the breeding season, so they are completely insectivorous. And they have a sit and wait hunting style. And I would say probably 75% of their insect captures are made on the ground. So they'll often perch on these really low, like on low shrubs or the low bare branches of a ponderosa pine or other conifer in their habitat. And they'll kind of survey the area. And when they spot an insect, they'll pounce down on it, kind of like what bluebirds do. I don't see very many aerial captures of insects, although they will like other flycatchers. But these guys are really like a pounce and capture prey on the ground type hunting style. Okay, so why did we do this study? Why study the gray flycatcher? Well, for one, they're a neotropical migrant. So that group of birds has some inherent problems with population sizes and different strategies and different obstacles they face during migration. So they're a more sensitive bird group. This species, as I mentioned, is found in primarily dry habitat, but it's throughout the western United States. And you can see they have a pretty extensive breeding range. And Washington is kind of on the northern end of that. And this species was actually only first described nesting in Washington in 1972, so fairly recently. And that just happened to be in Yakama County in the Wenas area where my study took place. As I mentioned, they occur in both shrubby and forested habitats, and that could be anywhere from sagebrush to bitterbrush, pines, firs, and juniper, depending on where they are in their extensive range. And before I did my study, there had been no detailed studies of the gray flycatcher in Washington, and especially in Ponderosa pine forest throughout their range. So I thought this would make a pretty good species to study, because I was seeing a lot of them in my long-term white-headed woodpecker study area. And when I started kind of investigating this species, I realized nobody has ever looked at this bird, especially in Ponderosa pine, and never before in Washington. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to kind of see what this bird is up to during the breeding season. And they're also not studied in detail over much of their range. So I thought it would make a good candidate. So my objectives were to first assess the breeding territory density. So find out how many breeding males there are in the habitat. Determine demographic variables. Now, what we mean by demographic variables are those that determine the population status. So clutch size, the number of fledglings, things related to reproductive output. Also to describe the nest site characteristics. So where are these birds building the nest? Are they using the pines? Are they primarily nesting in the shrubs in the understory? We just didn't know. And we also wanted to look at what was influencing nest survival. So we wanted to examine the spatial or the habitat variables, and also the temporal or the time factors associated with daily nest survival at both the area around the nest itself, the small kind of area, and also the nest patch. So what the habitat is around where the birds are nesting, and those two scales in terms of how they influence nest survival. So my study area was in the low elevation Ponderosa pine forest in the Wenas Valley. And I said that was northwest of Yakima. A lot of birders are familiar with the Wenas. This is kind of an overview picture of what the study area looks like. It's primarily 95% Ponderosa pine as the dominant tree species. And a lot of it has an extensive history of timber management. So it's an open forest type. It's not very dense. And looking at it as you're walking through, this is what a lot of the stands look like where I was doing my research. So you can see very open understory, very little shrub cover in most places. And the overall structure of the Ponderosa pines are fairly small. These aren't really large trees. A lot of these are regenerating forests from timber harvest. So you don't see a lot of old growth in this area at all. So kind of mid-seral Ponderosa pine forest. So here's a map showing where the Wenas campground is. This is the Wenas Valley. You can see the Oak Creek State Wildlife Area there. Here we have, hopefully you can see my cursor. There's the county line right here between Yakama and Kittitas County. And here's the campground. And these red boxes were my study plots where I did the Gray Flycatcher study. And you can see by the green areas how kind of fragmented this forest type is here. It's kind of right on the edge of the shrub steppe, and it's interspersed with a lot of lithosol areas that are mostly low shrubs and grass and forbs. Okay, so how did we do the study? Well, to assess breeding density, we started surveying gray flycatchers in late April and early May, about the time that they start returning from migration. And I believe the earliest, usually the males start showing up about April 15th, right around the middle of May. We did 5 study plots. Here's kind of an example here of what a study plot would look like. And there were 4 parallel transects located across the plot. And we did 2 surveys that were about 9 to 14 days apart. So here on this diagram, you can see the red dots. Those would be males that we detected on the first survey. And then blue dots would be males that we detected on the second survey. And the yellow dots that popped up would be a nest site that I found during when they started breeding. So I defined a territory as either 2 male detections. So there we have 2 male detections, 1 male detection and a nest, or just a nest site, as illustrated in the red circle there. And so areas where I just detected 1 singing male and I never got another recording, or I never found a nest, I did not count those as a known breeding territory. And every time I did the survey, I GPS'd each singing male's location. So I was able to plot these out on a map and actually be able to see where I had clusters of 2 male points, and also with a map. Okay. So after we did the initial breeding surveys of singing males, then we switched to doing nest searching. And I did this from about mid-May to about mid-July, and on those same plots. And we basically did this and looked for a variety of different cues in order to find nests. So we used adults carrying food or nesting material, an accidental encounter. Sometimes I would just be walking by a Ponderosa Pine or a bitter brush, and I'd flush a gray flycatcher and I'd just start looking for the nest. So those would be accidentals. And also scolding calls. Gray flycatchers have a unique call that they make. It's kind of like a twit call or a very emphatic single note call that they make. And after I started doing this, especially in my second year of doing the study, I realized that they would give that call whenever I was getting close to a nest. And so I would use that call as sort of like start focusing on an area to do a nest search. So I checked the nests with either a cavity probe or an above the nest, or with a cell phone. And so when I was doing my white-headed woodpecker work, when I was doing the breeding work for that species, I actually had a telescoping pole that would go up to about, I'd say probably about 11 meters in length, so about 30 feet high. And it had a probe, like a long probe on the end of it, about this long. And we could stick that probe inside the nest cavity. And it had 2 downward pointing LED lights and a camera inside. And then it would send an image to a screen that I had on the base of the pole that I could look at. And so I thought, well, why can't I use that to look at gray flycatcher nests if I find them higher than what I can see in? And so it worked out pretty well about halfway through the first field season. But I wanted a way to be able to document what the contents of the nests were and be able to document them with photos. So I have a friend, and his name is Kevin, and I call him my MacGyver. He helps me do a lot of my white-headed woodpecker banding, a lot of my other songbird banding as well. And he's the type of guy that I could come up with an idea and he can build it or create it. He's absolutely amazing. So I asked him, I said, I have an old cell phone. And I said, is there a way that I could rig this up to use it on the telescoping pole and just be able to put the cell phone over a nest and take a photo with a remote camera release? And he goes, I got you. He says, I'll figure it out. Not like 3 days later, he had it all built and set up, and it was great because I could raise it up. I could take 3 or 4 pictures with a remote camera release, and I could bring it down and I could look at exactly what I had on the cell phone, and I didn't have to carry around the battery pack and the other screen for the monitor, and it was much more efficient and much easier for me to carry around. And that's how I got almost all these elevated nest pictures. And you can see here, I always say trying to find me is kind of like trying to play the game Where's Waldo or Where's Jeff, but I'm right down here. So I got myself in a lot of the photos, unfortunately, but it's kind of funny to see me pop up in some of these. But you can see how well the camera worked, being able to photo document what the nests were and how they were built and attached to the trees and that. So it was pretty creative. So after we find a nest, we would determine the initiation date, and what we mean by that is when the first egg was laid, and not when the nest itself was built. And we also recorded the contents of the fate every time we checked a nest. And so say I found a nest and it had 2 eggs in it, and the next time I went back and checked that nest, it had 4 eggs in it. So I knew that on the day that I found 2 eggs, that they were still in the laying process. So I could backtrack that one day, and because they lay 1 egg about every day, that I could estimate the initiation date as the day before I found it. And we could also do that with if the nest had young, because we could, once we had seen enough nests, we could figure out how old the young were just by their developmental stage, and we would backtrack from there based on an average clutch size. So that's how we determine initiation date, when we didn't actually find the nest when it had 1 egg. So some examples of what we would record when we found a nest. Here we have a nest that has 3 eggs in it. Now I don't know if this, at the point that I found this, I don't know if they were still laying because they have an average clutch size of about 4. So we would just record this as 3 eggs and then check it the next time we came back. Here we have a nest with a just hatched nestling. So this nest had 4 eggs, and one of the eggs had just hatched, and the parents had already removed the shell. And so now we know, like for this nest, that okay, hatching started on this date, whatever that day would be. And with a 4 egg clutch, we could then backtrack from there to the point of nest initiation. Here we have a nest with 4 nestlings in it, and these guys are about, I'd say, probably 8 to 10 days old. They're still mostly blind, and they still gape in response to a nest disturbance, as you can see this little guy right here, kind of begging when he felt the camera above the nest and bumping the tree. And here we have another nest that looks like it has 1 nestling in it, but this nestling was not a gray flycatcher. This was actually a brown-headed cowbird. And when I saw this, this is a nest I found as it had 1 nestling in it. I did not see the cowbird egg, so I wasn't sure that this was a cowbird. But then when we checked it on this date, I could not believe how large the chick was, and the other 3 eggs still had not hatched. So then I knew that, okay, this is a brown-headed cowbird. And I'll talk about their frequency of parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds a little bit later on. But this would be recorded as a parasitized nest with a cowbird chick. This would be an example of a nest failure, and this one was probably due to weather. Here we have, there's 1 egg here, 1 egg here, and 1 egg here on the ground. And this had occurred, I checked this, I found this the day after we had a series of thunderstorms come through the area. And so I hypothesized that this nest probably blew out with the winds from the thunderstorm because predators would never leave an egg uneaten if a predator had tried to raid this nest. So this was an event due to weather, and this was very rare. This hardly ever happened. Here we have a photo on the left of a predated nest or a depredated nest where the contents were taken by a predator. And the contents of the nest lining itself is all disheveled and all pulled up. And you would not see this in a nest that had fledged young, which is what we have over here on the right. You can see how smooth the nest cup is, and there's actually a little bit of feces in there from the nestlings. And the parents don't seem to be as fastidious in taking out the fecal sacs when the young are close to fledging. So if we check the nest and we found that it looked like this on the photo on the right, we would determine that it was a successful fledging. And if we found a nest on the left, especially if it happened before the fledging date, we knew that that nest was taken by a predator. Okay, so nest and patch vegetation. So what did we record for habitat? So basically we were looking at variables that may influence the survival of that nest. And so at the nest level, we recorded the nest orientation and the height. And what I mean by orientation is the direction that that nest is facing or oriented away from the main stem of the plant. So we would, say a nest was oriented towards the east, then we would record that as an eastern orientation. We recorded the tree or the shrub species the nest was in, the height of that plant, and also the diameter if it was a tree, the diameter of breast height, that's what DBH means. The distance of the nest from the trunk of the tree. When gray flycatchers nest in a Ponderosa pine, they either locate the nest adjacent to the trunk, right next to the bark, or they'll locate it out on a branch. So we were interested in what is the distance and how far do flycatchers place the nest, because that could influence predation rates. And we also recorded the distance of the nest substrate, so the distance that the plant containing the nest was from a nearest tree. And I'll go into that a little bit more in our results and how that why we looked at that and how that factors in. So at the patch scale, which turned out to be about 1/10 of an acre, this was measured in an 11.3 meter radius circle centered on the nest. We estimated the percent cover of herbaceous plants, so your forbs, things like that, flowering plants, the percent cover of shrubs, and the average height of those shrubs, the average canopy cover, and the tree density and average tree height. So those were the patch scale compared to the actual nest scale itself. So two different scales of habitat measurements. Okay, so how did we analyze nest survival? How did we look at, how did we determine what causes or what influences how many nests produce offspring? So in a nice scientific, confusing sort of way, we used a logistic exposure model fit within a Bayesian framework to model the daily survival probability of flycatcher nests. Now you're all probably sitting there scratching your heads like, what in the world did this man just say? Well, this is what it looks like written out in code. And there won't be a test on this at the end, so you don't have to worry about it. But this is kind of an analysis of looking at how all the variables we measured fit in based on the different periods of the nesting cycle. So the building stage, the laying stage, the incubation stage, and the nestling stage. But in a simpler way, we used a fancy computer program to see if time or habitat effects influence nest survival. So that's kind of the layman's terms and the way I understand it, because I'm not a modeler, and that's why I have two co-authors that can do this sort of thing for me. So as I mentioned, we looked at different stages of the nesting cycle. And so we were interested in a final product, basically, of a period survival rate. So what is the survival rate for the building stage, the laying stage, the incubation stage, and the nestling stage? And the building, it takes about, on average, 8 days for them to build a nest. It takes, with an average clutch size, 4 days to lay their eggs. They incubate on average about 14 days, and the nestlings are in the nest for about 16 days. So from the time they start building a nest to the time the last nestling leaves the nest, the adults are at that site for 42 days. So it's quite an investment in the reproductive cycle for these birds. Okay, so the fun stuff, the results. Okay, so in 2014, we estimated there were 58 breeding territories per square mile. And in 2015, there was 85 breeding territories per square mile. And statistically, those two, 58 and 85, did not differ between the years. And I don't know a way to explain why we saw such a jump, other than it could be perhaps that I just got better at finding keeping track of the males, figuring out where they were, and also doing the nest searching and actually identifying more territories. But I don't think that accounts for all of it. And we know that populations of birds fluctuate over time. And so this could be just a natural variability in, perhaps they had a good migration north and south, so we didn't lose a lot of birds, so there was more returning to breed. We just don't know. But there was a little bit of variability, but statistically, we did not see a difference. We confirmed 74% of the territories were breeding with an actual nest site, so that was really good. So there wasn't a lot of assumptions that these birds were breeding and not actually nesting. So almost 3/4 of them actually, we did find a nest there. And 26% of the territory that we used in our estimate of density were actually 2 stinging male detections. So we know it wasn't, we're pretty confident that the territories we estimated were actually breeders there, and they were making an attempt at breeding. We ended up monitoring over the 2 years a total of 141 nests, so it was pretty good sample size. The peak nest initiation was during the last 2 weeks of May, and the earliest nest was on the 14th of May. So here we have a graph showing that. You can see that here we have that was the one nest we found during the week of between 10 and 16 May. And then we had a big jump. So this is when most of the birds are starting to initiate their first nest, were during the last 2 weeks of May. And then we see a little drop off, and then we see kind of a spike again, and a drop off and a spike. And so what we're seeing here later on in the breeding season is these are re-nesting attempts. And so if a nest fails during this time, the females will build a new nest and try to nest again. And if those fail and there's enough time, they will actually try to re-nest a third time. So that's what this kind of a up and down pattern you're seeing in the nest initiations. But the majority are the last 2 weeks of May. The average clutch size was 3.9 eggs, and I actually recorded the first 5 egg clutch for a gray flycatcher. That I could not find anything in the literature that listed potential clutch sizes being more than 4. So that was quite surprising. They fledge an average of 3.2 young per every successful nest attempt. So out of the average of 4 eggs, they're fledging about 3 chicks. And 30% of all the eggs laid that we monitored, only 30% resulted in a fledgling. So pretty low amount of young birds coming into the population from the total number of eggs that are laid. And for the biggest account of nest failures, that was due to predation. So predators are getting 90% of accounted for 90% of the failed nesting attempts in our study area. Brown-headed cowbirds only parasitized 7% of the nests and actually accounted for only 3% of the nest failures. So even though cowbirds parasitized 7% of the nest, some of their eggs actually failed due to predation as well. So cowbirds themselves only caused about a 3% nest failure rate, which is really, really low, and considering that this area is heavily grazed. And so I expected actually to see cowbird parasitism a little bit higher than what we actually witnessed. But these flycatchers are actually pretty rambunctious and pretty defensive of their nest sites. And I witnessed, at least on 2 different occasions, gray flycatchers chasing female cowbirds away from known nesting areas, and quite aggressively. I mean, they are pretty relentless in chasing these birds away. And so we think that their highly aggressive nature and the fact that the nest is almost not very frequently left unattended, even when they're laying, that helps keep down the rate of parasitism by cowbirds. So even though these guys are smaller than cowbirds, they can actually hold them off and prevent parasitism. And 6% of the failed nests were due to unknown causes. And so we just could not determine what the actual cause of failure was. So what were they nesting in? Well, somewhat surprisingly, 132 of the 141 nests were actually in Ponderosa Pine, and only 8 were in bitterbrush in the understory. And 1 was in a Douglas fir, and I think that actually might have been maybe 1 of 3 Douglas firs in my study area. So it was kind of interesting that they were actually used that one, almost one of the few Douglas firs that was out there. But Ponderosa pine seems to be the preferred nest substrate for these birds in this habitat. And even though we had bitterbrush scattered throughout in the understory of these pine forests, the birds weren't using them for nesting. They were pretty much almost tied completely to Ponderosa. And so 75 of the nests were located against the trunk of the tree, and 58 were out on the limb. So pretty good, almost a pretty good split there between where they located the nest. So there wasn't really much preference for one or the other. The average DBH of a nest tree was about 12 inches, and the average tree height was 42 feet. And the average nest height was about 15 feet, but that was really highly variable. We found them nesting anywhere from 2.2 feet above the ground to up to 44 feet off the ground. So again, nesting close to the trunk, nesting away from the trunk on a limb, nesting close to the ground, nesting up in the canopy. These birds were highly variable in their nest placement. They didn't really have a book to follow, it seemed like, for where they were going to nest. And sometimes that can make nest searching kind of tricky because you didn't really know where the nests were going to be. The average nest orientation was 19 degrees, so in a north-northeasterly aspect. And we think this has to do probably with thermal regulation. This is a really hot and dry environment, especially during the breeding season. So orienting and placing your nest at an angle that is to the north or northeast probably provides some thermoregulatory cooling for the nest so it doesn't get as warm as compared to, say, like a western or a southern exposure. The average canopy cover surrounding the nest sites was about 40%, and that's what you would expect for an open Ponderosa pine forest. And fairly low shrub cover in most places. The average shrub cover around the nest was about 16%. And the average tree density was only about 42 trees per acre. But again, that was also highly variable, anywhere from no trees, just the one that they nested in, to about 121 trees per acre. Okay, so nest survival. So what influences how well these birds are able to reproduce? Is there anything that comes out of our analysis? So the first thing we found was that there was a positive association between the daily survival rate, so the probability of a nest surviving a given day, and the distance of the nest tree to the nearest tree. So remember I said that we actually measured that distance from the tree that the birds were nesting in to its closest nearest neighbor. So that actually influences nest survival. So what does that mean? Well, here we have a graph showing what this representation is. So on the left, here we have on the y-axis, we have an average daily nest survival probability. So that is the probability the nest will survive a given day during that nesting cycle. And you can see it ranges from 90 to 100%. Then these dotted lines are the 90% confidence intervals. So basically our estimate of accuracy of the results. And on the x-axis, we have distance to the nearest tree. So you can see that as the distance to the nearest tree increases from 5 meters up to 15 meters, that the daily survival probability also increases. Goes from about almost close to 0.95% to up above about 98%. So there is a definite influence of distance to nest tree on nest survival. So that was one result that we found. And so in the habitat, what does that mean? So here we have my mock-up of what an open Ponderosa pine forest looks like. Here we have Ponderosa pine trees. We have some shrubs in the understory. We have some down logs. And here's the nest. Here's one nest we find. It's out in a Ponderosa pine, the yellow dot circle right here, kind of by itself, kind of separated from other Ponderosa pine trees. And then we have another nest here in red that's located in a cluster of Ponderosa pine trees with interconnecting canopies. And so our results showed that this nest in yellow has a higher probability of fledging young than the nest than the red nest. And you may ask, well, okay, well, why? What does that mean? Well, if you look at the predator community, here we have a Douglas squirrel. It's one of the common, probably our most common squirrel in this habitat type. They're an arboreal species. They're a species that spends a lot of times in the trees, feeding on cones, different things, but also foraging on the ground. And so if you're a Douglas squirrel, you're going to forage for cones and other food prey items or food products in your grocery list in clusters of trees where you yourself are safer from predation. So if you're a squirrel, you're not going to run out from this nice group of Ponderosa pine trees to investigate this one lone Ponderosa pine that's separated from everybody else, because you could get nabbed by a hawk, you could get nabbed by a coyote. There's a lot of predators that feed on squirrels. Now, if you're a Steller's jay, which is another nest predator out there, research has shown that jays will often preferentially forage in thick areas of thicker cover because they can move from canopy to canopy and through tree to tree, looking for nests, looking for food, insects, things like that. And they're less apt to fly out to investigate a single tree that's located away because they're maximizing their foraging efficiency. So you can imagine if you're a gray flycatcher, it's safer to nest out in a tree that's kind of separated away from other trees in terms of predation. Okay. So the second thing we found was a positive association between the daily survival rate and nest height. So again, we look at a graph with average daily nest survival, same scale on the y-axis, and now on the x-axis we have nest height, which goes from 5 to 10 meters and above. And you can see the same thing. As nests are located higher in a tree or a shrub, that the daily probability of survival increases. So basically, if you're nesting farther off the ground, your nest is going to fledge more young and potentially safer from predators. Now, as I mentioned, we had flycatchers nest, anywhere from 2.2 feet off the ground to 44 feet. So this left-hand photo here is a nest that's actually in a little Ponderosa pine sapling, and gray flycatchers actually used this nest 3 years in a row. Even one year when I wasn't doing this study, since this was in my white-headed woodpecker study area, I walked by this area all the time, and I flushed another flycatcher out of the same nest site. But then again, looking at the photo on the right, they'll nest against the trunk of a Ponderosa pine tree 30 feet high. So nests that are located in position number 1 here to the left are much less safer from a predator, especially a terrestrial ground predator, than a nest that's located higher in a tree. So potential ground or terrestrial predators that spend a lot of time on their ground, include the yellow pine chipmunk, garter snake, we have a long-tailed weasel, we have a gopher snake here, and we have a golden mantle ground squirrel. So if you're a gray flycatcher and you're trying to place your nest in a strategically safe place, you want it higher up in a tree, away from these terrestrial ground predators that will scale a tree to look for bird nests and for different prey items, and even though they're primarily on the ground. So here we've seen that gray flycatchers are faced with a couple different trade-offs in terms of nest location and nest placement. And the third thing we found was there was a negative association between the daily survival rate and the laying and the incubation period compared to the building stage. And so what this relates or turns into is that the period survival rate is lower during incubation and nestling than during the building stage. And so here I have a graph showing that as well. So here we have, again, period nest survival probability on the y-axis from 40 to 100%. And now here we have the stages of the nesting cycle. So we have the building stage, the laying stage, the incubation, and the young or the nestling stage. And these are the 90% confidence intervals, these upper and lower bars here, and the dot is the actual mean. And so what we want to do is we want to look at this graph and say, okay, which variables do not have overlapping confidence intervals, because those are significant. So here, the building stage on the left has confidence intervals that don't overlap the incubation or the young stage. And so those are statistically different. So survivorship is much higher when the birds are building than when they have incubated, than when they're incubating or when there's young. And so if you think of this from the point of a predator and its prey, predators are very cued into activity and activity centers and movement of their prey. So during the building stage, you know, the flycatchers are coming and going, they're depositing, you know, nesting material, but they're really not staying at the nest for a very long time. Same thing with the laying stage. They're going in there, the females are dropping an egg, and they're leaving, but they're keeping an eye on the nest, but they're not associated with the nest itself. But that all changes during the incubation period when the females have to be on those eggs to keep them incubated. And she is the only one that incubates, the male does not. And so when she needs to feed, she has to leave that nest unattended. And she'll go out and she'll forage throughout the understory for insects very, very quickly. And this is a behavior that we often use to determine if a nest was in the area and we hadn't found it yet, was by following a flycatcher that was moving, you know, foraging, just boom, 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 you know, going after insect after insect. And they usually do it in a circular route that works their way back to the nest site itself. And so all that activity going to and from the nest when she's incubating, and then again also when they're feeding nestlings, you know, they're bringing food, both adults are bringing food back and forth to the nest. All that activity is going to attract a predator. So we see lower survival probabilities when the birds are incubating and when there's young present in the nest. And so that's kind of what we would have expected to see, and that is a very frequent pattern with most breeding bird studies, is that there's often a decline in the probability of a nest surviving during incubation and young. Okay, so our conclusions. Flycatchers are faced, as I said, with trade-offs regarding nest placement. Does a flycatcher place its nest near the trunk of a tree, as the right photograph here? Does it locate its nest out on the limbs of the branch, as this photograph here? Does the female locate her nest high in a tree, or low in a tree, or low in a shrub? And does she choose a substrate, a tree or a shrub, that's close to other trees or farther away? So you can see that there's multiple spatial choices and trade-offs that a flycatcher has to work out in order to determine what's the safest place to build a nest. And they, you know, it's like a female, you know, going out and finding a male's territory, and then she has to build a nest. You know, she's faced with a lot of different choices to make. And what is the safest choice? Does she build a nest to thwart and ward off terrestrial predators? Does she pick a nesting site that's going to be better against aerial and arboreal predators such as jays and Douglas squirrels? So you can see that it's not a simple choice. And so what we think is going on here is that the choice for a safest nest site, which is actually high in a tree and isolated from everybody else, may actually be linked to experience. And because we would think that if all gray flycatchers know inherently or genetically that, oh, I have to build my nest as high up in a tree as possible and as far away from other trees as possible, that we would see all nests built that way, and we don't. And so we're not sure if it's just a matter of trial and error for these birds, or is it linked to experience? So you can imagine a female flycatcher returning to her breeding grounds as a first-year breeding bird. She's never built a nest before, and she's faced with all these choices for where she's going to put her nest. So let's say her first nest, she chooses a bitter brush that's in a cluster of other bitter brushes, and she builds her nest, and boom, gets predated. Like third day, she's in, laying eggs. So the next nest, she picks a Ponderosa pine tree, and she puts her nest high up in that Ponderosa pine, say 15 feet high, and it's against the trunk of a tree. And she's successful there. So she may build there again the next breeding season. And so, and they've actually shown this with color-banded brewer sparrows. There's been studies done on them where they can actually track individual birds over time. And they show that they do learn, and they do end up picking the safest nesting choices through experience. So, this is all hypothesis on our part, but we're thinking that's probably what's going on with these birds, because, when you're faced with a suite of predators that could be coming at you from all different areas, trying to figure out what that safest nest site is going to be difficult. And what we're showing is that the higher they place it in a substrate and the farther away that substrate is from other substrates, that results in the greatest probability of a nest being successful. Okay. So just a few acknowledgements here. The Bureau of Indian Affairs provided the funding for my job and also for doing this research study. And again, I wanted to mention Kevin Lucas, who's helped with the nest site vegetation sampling. And as I said, he was my MacGyver that created the cell phone setup. And with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions. I saw a bunch coming through on the chat, and so hopefully we can get those funneled through to me. But I also wanted to mention, excuse me, down below is a citation for this research that was published in the paper was published in the Journal of Field Ornithology. And I sent Elaine and Vicki, I believe, I sent them the PDFs of this publication. And so if anybody would like that publication, they can either email me directly or they can email Elaine or Vicki, and they can send you that. So you can read more on the study if you're interested. So, yeah.
Jeff, this is Vicki, and I'm so thankful to Andy Stepnevsky for telling us about you. I've just been looking at some articles in Birds of the World, and I now know where all that data comes from. Kind of meticulous work that you have just shown us. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah. Yep.
Well, if I may, I'll be the voice coming from somewhere. With some really great questions that our folks have posed. First one was the breeding match. Maybe Jeff, if it were possible, could you go back to your breeding range map in Eastern Washington? Mark Oberly was asking, he wanted a little more detail if they bred in the Colville Reservation area and in the southeastern Blue Mountains.
Okay.
Is that easy for you to go back to?
Yeah, I should be up. Oh, no, it's not. There we go. So there's the range map. And it does look like they go across northern, kind of north central Washington. And I'm not particularly sure where that region is. I'm outside of the east slope of the Cascades. I'm not familiar with Blue Mountains or the Colville Reservation in terms of the bird communities there.
Does look like it.
This range map, I believe I took from Birds of North America. I think that's what I...
It says that at the bottom.
Yeah, okay. That part's blocked on my screen, so I couldn't see it. But Yeah, so this was the most up-to-date range map that I could find according to the Birds of North America, and I believe the species account for gray flycatcher was updated in, I think, 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So this should be fairly current, but you know, it's not precise with, you know, particular eBird locations or what birders are finding. So that, you know, there may be a little bit of discrepancy in the range map here. Yeah.
Mark, if that didn't answer your question enough, feel free to unmute yourself and ask another level of it. Okay. Several questions, of course, about nests, nest construction.
Yes.
What material? Sorry, is that? Oh, yeah, that's you. What materials do the gray flycatchers typically use in building their nests?
Okay. From what we can tell, the majority of the nest structure itself is dried grass from the previous growing season. So it's grass that, you know, is died over the winter, and they're pulling those dry grass pieces off the ground and using those to form the nest bowl. But they actually use quite a bit of spider webs, kind of like how hummingbirds do. And I've watched female flycatchers moving through the branches of Ponderosa Pine, and I could see them grabbing things and collecting things, but I could never see anything in the bill, like they were collecting moss or some other kind of you know, substrate. And then I would watch the female fly to a nest, and she would sit down in the bowl of the nest and run her bill around the outside and that. And so I'm thinking she's spreading the spider silk around through the grass to bind it all together and to make it more, to make it flexible.
That's fascinating. Have you actually looked at some of the nests that fell out to see if you could detect anything similar to a bush tit nest?
It's hard to detect the actual webbing in there, but if you like, because I found a few that were on the ground or old ones from previous years, and they don't last very long. But we did have one that blew out of a nest, out of a tree, and it was almost completely intact. And I have it in a plastic bag in my office, and it is very pliable and very flexible.
Elastic.
Very elastic. And the center of it, the lining is a real fine, little pieces of fur, some small feathers, really, really fine plant material that makes it a nice soft lining on the inside. And a lot of times it'll be like pieces of elk fur or sheep fur or cow fur, things like that they actually line the soft inside of the nest. So it's a pretty elaborate structure, which is probably why it takes them 8 days, you know, to build a nest. So, but I thought the spider silk thing was very unique and very interesting.
You got so familiar with the locations of your nest. Did you ever see evidence you thought of reuse of a nest from a previous year? Our MC Dave Armstrong asked that one.
Yes, we did have one nest site, that small one that was in the little sapling, the picture I showed you. That was used 3 different years in a row, and they didn't, you know, by the time a flycatcher comes back the following season, the old nest itself is pretty much gone. It's pretty much dissolved and broken down. But they used the exact same spot where the previous nests were. They just built a new nest there.
Oh, that makes sense.
So there's something about some of the sites that the birds really like. Now, whether or not that was the same female or not, I'm not sure. Or, you know, but I suspect it probably was. But yeah. But that was pretty rare. Most of the time it was, you know, a brand new nest site.
I think I've just stolen back. Have I stolen back? Yes, except I have a bunch of junk in the way. Sorry about that. I'm not very good at this. You shared this wonderful photo that I think hopefully the audience can see it now, of you in a slightly different decade, but you have this wonderful spotted owl chick. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came to be?
Yes, that was in 2003. So that was 1 year after I started my job at the Yakama Nation. And there was a biologist at the time, her name was Gina King, and they were, the Yakama Nation was doing a long-term banding study on spotted owls on the Yakama Reservation. And I had mentioned to her that I had never seen a spotted owl before. And she knew I was a big birder and that. So she invited me to come out with her and her technician one day to go out to this breeding pair where they knew the young had fledged. So they were what they call branchlings, where they're kind of clambering around on the branches because they wanted to band them, and they wanted to band I believe one of the adults needed to be banded. And so I was like, sure, I'll go out and help. And so they were able to capture all 3 of the fledglings, and this is one of them here that I got to hold while they were doing the processing. And to date is the only spotted owls I have ever seen. And so to me, it's a memory that's etched in my head forever. And that's one reason why I use it for my profile pic, even though it was many years ago now. I don't look quite like that anymore, but it was a very memorable experience. And
awfully glad you shared that. Let's see, there's so many good things and people are clearly engaged. Let me just add one. Michael responded, he looked at the eBird data, that question that Mark had about where they nest. eBird data, there are several records from the Blue Mountains and quite a few along the Spokane River, but little to none in the Colville.
oh, okay.
A second ago, you were talking about the nest and the spider web, and I was thinking bush tit, and someone has actually read my mind. Do visits to a nest by humans seem to link to predation events in any way? We've been told not to stare at bush tit nests with our binoculars because the crows will come and predate those nests.
Right. And we, there have been, I've been doing nesting studies, that's why I started with in graduate school doing, part of my work there was doing a breeding bird study on Chihuahuan desert birds. And so, I've had a lot of experience with nest searching, with nest monitoring, and using the techniques that are best possible for doing this type of work. And there's been actually quite a few research papers that have gone in and looked at this same question that people ask about. And they could find no evidence between nests that were visited by people and nests that were visited by people routinely during nest monitoring, and predation rates at nests that were just using remote cameras. And they couldn't find because a lot of people say, well, if you walk to a nest, a mammal is going to follow you to that nest because it's following your scent. And in general, most animals are afraid of people, so they're not going to be following human scent. Now, one thing we did have to be careful about when we were doing our study was Steller's jays, because they are smart enough to follow people around and to understand what you're doing fairly quickly. And there was a few times where I was going up to check one of my Gray Flycatcher nests, and I noticed Steller's jays were in the area, and I did not check the nest either that day, or I waited and came back a couple hours later, because I didn't want the disturbance at the nest and flushing the bird and potentially her giving alarm calls to attract jays to that area to start investigating where the nest is. So, we tried to be aware as much as possible of that. But, in general, for the amount of time we spend at a nest, we're going up there, especially when I'm doing this remotely with a telescoping pole, putting it up there, I'm snapping a few pictures, I'm putting it down, and I'm out of there, so one of the techniques we also use is not to go up to a nest, check it, and then turn around and go back the other way, because you never want to leave a dead end at a nest in case a predator or something is following your behavior, because that point where you turn around is often where they're going to investigate. So we would do stuff like continue on past the nest, so we try to be as safe as possible when we're out there doing that. We acknowledge that we are interfering in a way, but we try to do it the best way possible. So yeah.
Excellent. Here's another couple that have to do with habitat and trees. I think you can take it together. Does the nest density vary with the habitat type? And did you find that, where's that other one? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, go for that one. I've lost my other question that was connected.
Okay. So I don't know the answer to that question, because we primarily worked in the one habitat type. So we didn't look at other areas where flycatchers could potentially be nesting. So
yes. Yes.
instance,
Here
for
was
instance,
the one.
oh, go ahead.
Here's the one. Was there a higher likelihood of flycatchers choosing nesting spots in ponderosas that were separated farther away from other trees? That phenomenon you noticed. Did they seem to prefer that more isolated tree? Choosing nest spots in ponderosa pines that were farther away from other trees.
Yeah,
You know what we really want you to do, Jeff, is we want you to ban all these birds so you can tell us how many years you watched that bird.
Right.
You've got to combine all these other studies you've done on the white-headed woodpecker and the golden-crowned sparrows.
I know. You know, I don't know if we saw a preference for them choosing isolated trees. I think if there had been an actual preference for that, we would have seen more trees with greater distances between their nearest neighbors than what we did. And so I think, like I said, I think a lot of it is sort of the birds trying to figure out where that safest place is. And, you know, in an ecosystem where there's such a diversity of predators, that's a really hard thing to do.
Yes.
And so I think it's almost a matter of trial and error where they're placing until they can figure it out, you know, and we just don't know how long those birds are in the environment that figure it out before their natural mortality takes place, you know.
And what is the life expectancy of a gray flycatcher?
I don't know.
All right.
Yeah, I really don't know that answer. Yeah.
Well, we'd like you to also track the offspring from one nest that was successful and find if those babies tend to follow the nest habit of their parent. All right.
Yeah. Right on that. Yeah.
Several good questions. Some of us who've been to the area that you were in love Wenas. We're wondering about fire, and of course there was a horrible impact last summer.
Right.
Cindy Burrell, who's our prior wonderful Vicky King, wondered if you could comment on the impact of the 2020 fires in that area, and considering the variety of heights of nests. Well, I guess that's another question, but on the impact of fires to this bird and its nesting sites.
Yeah. You know, the Evans Canyon fires, the one that burned, started in the Wenas. It started in Evans Canyon, which is a little bit east of the Barbecue Flats area. And the winds at that time were out of the west, so it pushed the fire easterly. And so it did not impact the area of like Barbecue Flats, the Wenas campground, the Mud Flats area, you know, the Wenas riparian area. It moved eastward along the south or along the north slope of Clemens Ridge and down past Wenas Lake. You know, it burned, you know, hundreds of thousands of acres that way. And some of that is Ponderosa pine habitat. From what I saw and from what I can see, it was in some places it burned very hot and all the trees were killed. In other places, it burned more of a mosaic where it left, you know, patches of live, you know, Ponderosa pine. And Ponderosa pine is very fire resistant. So I think you're going to see sort of like a combination of mosaic, burned and unburned areas, as well as highly burned areas. And the areas that burned in a mosaic, I think will still hold some of the species that are found in, you know, open Ponderosa pine habitat, like the gray flycatcher. It'll just be interesting to see how many years, you know, that takes. Are they going to immediately move into that area post fire? You know, I just don't know enough about this bird's ecology to understand how they respond, you know, to fire in this area.
I'm reading a question that I think I'll just read it, see if we can make it out. Chingling Ma wrote, why are there so many variations in nesting height and distance to other trees? For many years of natural selection, one would think that the successful nesters would survive and result in more uniform nesting behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
And
if we had, yeah, perfect evolution and smart birds.
Right. And, you know, and so what I'm thinking, what we're thinking is happening here is that when birds are faced with a diversity of potential nest predators. And if you think about this ecosystem, you have predators that originate from the ground, you have predators that originate from the air and from the arboreal portions of the trees. And so if you're a songbird and you're trying to find the safest place to build your nest, it's going to be really hard to figure out what that is and have it work all the time. And so it's probably not something that's going to evolve evolutionarily and be passed on in the genetic code. For instance, like something like a migratory route is, where a lot of, almost all migration and neotropical migrants is genetically encoded in their DNA, so they know where to go and how to get there without having to follow their parents. When you're building a nest, you're faced with a whole onslaught of different things. You have weather to think about, you have thermal regulation, you have, a variety of different predators. And so trying to figure out exactly what that safest nest site is probably more trial and error than it is trying to replicate that over time. Does that sort of make sense?
I think so.
Okay. And so, like I said, without having these birds color banded and actually following individual females and seeing, how they make those choices, it's speculation on our part. But from what I know about bird biology, this is kind of the best kind of answer I can give to some of these hypotheses that we came up with. Now, there was one situation where I know one female re-nested 3 different times. Her nest failed every single time. And every single time she built her nest in a completely different place. And so she did not go back and repeat the kind of the ingrained response, like, okay, well, I can only build my nest in this one scenario. She altered her scenarios 3 different times. And unfortunately, all 3 times she failed, and that could just be dumb luck, on her part. Maybe her territory was in the territory of a Steller's jay. And so wherever she moved and built her nest, that jay was smart enough to know, well, I'm going to go back to this area because I found a nest last time. You know what I mean? And so there's a lot of things going on in terms of figuring out, for these birds to figure out what's the safest place to nest. And sometimes it might be dumb luck, and sometimes it might be trial and error. We just don't know. That's why we keep doing all these studies, is because you start doing one study and you get all these questions, and that fuels the next study. And, not to diverge from this, but that's why I've been studying white-headed woodpeckers for 17 years, because I always have more questions that come up from my research. And so you can see how these patterns repeat themselves, and trying to answer these same questions that everybody else has here. So these are great questions, and they're ones that we think about, and we just, we try to make our best guess, but without further study, we just don't know for sure.
Speaking of migration, do we happen to know if the young first years migrate together with the parents? Do they all go sort of at the same season?
Yeah, they actually leave at different times. The young stay quite a bit longer than the adults do. And the adults actually, when they migrate south, unlike a lot of songbirds that molt prior to their molt, gray flycatchers, and I think other Empidonax as well, actually molt on their wintering grounds.
Oh, yes.
So the adults leave a little bit earlier. And so a lot of the birds that we see later on, like into September, are mostly young of the year. And part of that reason is because they're still learning, especially if they hatched late. If they were the result of a second or a third nesting attempt, they take a little bit more time to put on fat and to, build their strength and get their foraging strategies down. And so we see that with a lot of birds, where the adults will leave first and then the young follow a few weeks later. Yeah.
I have 2 maybe final, if there are any more folks, tap them in. One person asked, and I'm interested too, can you tell us anything about the cell phone apparatus device that your friend put together for you? I know it's not commercially available, but any clues? Not that we're going to go out and start looking in nests, but.
Right. Well, the original setup I had was from a company called Sandpiper Technologies, and they specialize in these kind of remote camera kind of operations. And the first setup I had for doing the cavity nesting study, it was actually called a treetop peeper, is what it was called. And so we took modifications of that and we took my friend Kevin took the probe off, and he had a metal rod that he put in place of the probe into the extending portion of the I'm losing the word, but the extended portion part. And then at the end of that metal rod, he took the cell phone case that you normally clip on your belt, and he attached that to the metal rod. And then so I was able to clip my cell phone into the hip holder underneath the rod, and I turned the camera to selfie mode, and then I would extend that up over the nest, and then I had a Bluetooth release, and I would just hit that 3 or 4 times, and as I hear the shutter click on the cell phone, then I would bring it back down, and I'd flip it up so I could see the phone, and I'd go through the images, and if there were bad ones, I'd just delete them right away. And it was pretty slick. It was pretty neat. You know, it just took on hand what I already had, and the only thing he had to get were a few screws and bolts to put the cell phone clip onto the metal rod and buy the metal rod itself. But it sure came in handy for getting a lot of the really cool nest photos I was able to share tonight. So especially with the little nestlings in there. So
Yeah, well, if Fish and Wildlife starts to see a epidemic of people walking around with sticks and cell phones, we'll know who to blame.
right.
Perhaps this is one of the someone just added a question. It makes them jump. Where did it go? Someone wanted to know, what was the most unexpected finding or conclusion or series or observation that you had?
Let's see. Well, I guess I was surprised at how much a division of labor there was between the sexes in terms of how they nested. And what I mean by that is that the male was often fairly close to where the female would be building the nest, and he would often be calling or singing or vocalizing. And she would be bringing nesting material to the nest site, and she would, do all the building. She'd do all the incubating, and every once in a while, I would see a male bring a grasshopper to the female on the nest, and that was almost never done. And I couldn't figure out why, and I realized that only happened like the day before or the day of when the chicks were nesting. And I think that was his way of showing the female that he was ready to start bringing food to the chicks. And right after that is when the nest feeding started. And so I thought that was a really neat kind of gesture on his part, that was kind of his way of communicating to the female, like, okay, I know the kids are coming. I'm ready to bring the food now, whereas before he was just kind of like a standoff role. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. And it was kind of one of those neat observations you really don't see unless you're really studying these birds as frequently as we were.
Very interesting. Whew. Anybody else? I don't think I missed any, but apologize if I did. If you would like, you can just unmute your device and ask it.
Well, I have one more question, Yelene. Can I ask?
Can you go ahead?
Yes, Jeff said earlier, only the female incubate the eggs. Well, where does the male go at the same time? Just nearby, or?
Yeah. So when the female is incubating on the eggs, the male is in the territory, and we can often hear him singing or vocalizing or even sometimes foraging in the area where the female was nesting. And in terms of nest defense, because the sexes are identical, we're not sure how much the male would participate. But I'm assuming that if there was a disturbance to the nest and the female was riled up and giving defense calls, we would occasionally see the pair together in that response. So he is definitely around, but I think part of the thing is when they're doing incubation, they're trying to draw as little attention to that nest as possible. So if just one bird is coming to and from it, it's probably less disturbance and less attractive to predators than if the female was leaving and the male was bringing her food, and you're compounding that activity. So he's definitely around. He just doesn't involve himself with any part of incubation and really any part of the nest duties until the chicks hatch, and then he starts feeding.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Elaine, I have a question.
Go for it, Kent.
Hey, my son lives in Flagstaff, and right behind his house is a ponderosa forest. It looks exactly like the picture you showed with essentially no understory. Is there any way that he could put out a birdhouse and attract one of these birds to nest there?
They're not cavity nesters.
Well, these birds aren't going to be nesting in a nest box or any kind of a nest structure, and so not sure that would work.
Okay.
Jeff, I'll be sending you all the comments, many that are just telling you how much they enjoyed the precision and clarity of your presentation. And
Oh, great.
I'm going to turn that over now to Vicki, and thank you again. Look forward to finding you out there in Wenas when we get back there.
I'm out there almost all the time from May to about August, so.
Well, Jeff, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you again. I thought this was really fascinating stuff. And
Oh, you're very welcome.
I certainly hope that our audience will return again next month on April 5th, when Matt Bartels will talk to us about Washington's vagrants. Have a good night. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you. Yep, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeff. Good night, everyone. Wear your mask, wash your hands.
That's right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jeff. And I'm coming out, remember,